If you really take an objective view, the situation today is far better than it was in 2013. Go back to 2013, we had growth falling, inflation going up, the rupee declining, the balance of payments under pressure, the current account deficit way above the sustainable limit, investment sentiment was negative, and fiscal deficit, for all the commendable efforts of former Finance Minister Chidambaram, was still very high. If you look at today, growth is trending up, inflation is trending down, the rupee is steady, balance of payments is quite sturdy, foreign exchange reserves are at the highest level ever, current account deficit is significantly below the sustainable limit, public finances are on the mend, and investment sentiment is positive. You know, apart from all the macroeconomic parameters, if you take the political economy perspective as well, today is a lot different from 2013. 2013, we had a government which, by the Prime Minister's own admission, was weighed down by coalition pressures, and by 2013 had already got into an election mode when every decision was evaluated against electoral calculations. Whereas today we have a government that has no coalition pressures to speak of, has 4 years in office more, can take decisions with a reasonably long-term perspective, even within the electoral calendar. So I believe that in 2013 we were struggling with stabilization. Today we're struggling with structural adjustment.
Well, I'll ask you a little later in the program, how much has monetary policy contributed to the better situation? But before I do that, let me just turn my attention to the monetary policy framework agreement that has been signed between the Reserve Bank of India and the government. Given the dominance of the fisc over monetary policy in India, has the agreement really weakened or strengthened the RBI's hands? Because after all, the RBI is now being made responsible for something over which it has relatively limited control.
Yes, Maithili, that's one way of looking at it. Yes, the fiscal dominance is always there, has been there, but as we look forward, we'll look into a situation where the fiscal dominance will come down, the public finances will be on the mend, both at the center and in the states. So the pressure that comes on inflation and on the monetary policy stance from the fiscal stance will, I expect, to be diminished. But if you take a more objective view, the monetary policy framework can be seen as quite transformative. Because the Reserve Bank, the objective function of the Reserve Bank's reaction function currently and during my tenure were quite diffuse, quite opaque. Whatever the Reserve Bank did could be explained as a way as being consistent with the policy. Not that the Reserve Bank acted arbitrarily, but it looked arbitrary from the outside. So the monetary policy framework gives credibility, predictability, transparency, and contestability to the Reserve Bank's actions. And also note that when our inflation differential with the world cannot be very high. So you cannot have inflation in 7–8% in India when global inflation is 2% or even below that. So I believe the monetary policy framework is good. Yes, there are challenges. Not only the fisc that you mentioned, there are other challenges as well, which is that inflation in our country comes largely from supply constraints, and supply constraint resolution is with the government. And there's one other challenge to inflation management which has not been discussed very much, which is that in the years ahead, as we look at growth acceleration, inflation is going to come under pressure. When inflation comes under pressure, in China, for example, even as they were growing at a phenomenal rate, they could suppress consumption and therefore suppress inflation. That's not possible in a vigorous, vibrant democracy like ours. So as growth accelerates, there will be inflation pressures, and that's going to be a challenge on the Reserve Bank as well.
Yes, absolutely. There are going to be challenges in the Reserve Bank of India, and one of the unknowns in the Monetary Policy Framework Agreement is really about the composition of the MPC, the Monetary Policy Committee. What, to your mind, should the composition be, and will the proposed MPC really reduce the tensions between the Reserve Bank of India and the government, which are inevitable perhaps in any democracy, but have come to play in a big way in the Indian context?
Well, there are many open questions about the proposed MPC. How many members will there be? How many from within the RBI, how many from outside? Will there be a government official on the MPC? Will the members be full-time or part-time? How will they be chosen, etc.? I do not know what the government is going to decide on this, but let me give you my views on some of these issues. First of all, I feel very strongly that there should be no government official on the MPC, because having a government official, no matter how professional he is, how unbiased he or she is going to inhibit free and frank discussion in the MPC. I can say this because I was finance secretary, I was the governor, and I believe having a government nominee there is going to vitiate the quality of discussion there. Yes, the government will have a say. There is a mechanism today of the governor consulting, not consulting so much, but giving his view to the finance minister and the prime minister before every policy review, and taking into account their point of view, not necessarily doing what they want, but certainly listening to their point of view. That can be institutionalized. For example, the finance secretary can come and explain to the governor the government's point of view. But I believe having a government official is not a good thing.
As someone who has spent some years in the Reserve Bank of India, Dr. Subba Rao, I could not agree with you more as far as the government functionary on the MPC is concerned. But I'm not sure your former IAS colleagues will speak to you very much after hearing that comment. But if I may switch to something else that is closely related to this and the entire issue of inflation control, the recent fall in inflation that we've seen, is that a result more of fortuitous circumstances, or is it because of astute monetary policy? Because if you remember, starting from April 2009, you had actually raised interest rates 13 times before April 2012. You first cut interest rates to give growth a chance. In contrast, the recent regime in the Reserve Bank of India, rates have been raised just thrice, but yet inflation fell. So what does this mean about monetary policy? Is it completely useless? Are the lags too large? Or is it that sometimes credit is given where it is perhaps not quite warranted and credit is denied where it was warranted? How do you see the decline in inflation in recent times?
Well, I've always held, even as the governor and now as the ex-governor, that in a country like India, admittedly, inflation stems from supply-side constraints more often than not, except in a few episodes of inflation when demand was the main driver. But we've always held that monetary policy has to be the first line of defense, because if inflation persists for long enough, it gets generalized, and monetary policy has to act to anchor inflation expectations. So to that extent, I believe monetary policy has an impact no matter what the driver of inflation. Of course, there have been other circumstances that have contributed to the disinflationary trends, like for example, oil prices have fallen so much and the rupee has appreciated. So all these factors have contributed to the disinflationary trend. But to say that the Reserve Bank has no role at all, I think would be taking on quite an erroneous stand.
Find us on Facebook at facebook.com/ETNow, and don't forget to click the like button. You can also follow us on Twitter at ETNowLive. To stay updated with all our programming, hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel by logging on to youtube.com/user/ETNow.